We are just imperfect men trying to follow the lead of Christ and the Holy Spirit.
This is not to say that the slave is perfect and never makes mistakes, but Jehovah and Jesus trust the imperfect slave who cares for things to the best of his ability and with the best of motives. Shouldn't we then trust the imperfect slave as well?
But some may say, isn't the governing body made up of imperfect men? Yes, it is. The last perfect person to walk the earth was Jesus himself. There is no perfect person or organization on the globe. But as a longtime faithful brother used to say, this is the best imperfect organization on earth.
So, whom do you trust? You fully trust in Jehovah, Jesus, and the faithful slave. To a reasonable degree, you also trust all your fellow brothers and sisters.
Do these humble expressions impress you? Does hearing them move you to put your complete trust in everything these men have to say? I'm sure you would agree that since being imperfect means capable of making mistakes, no reasonable person would put complete trust in someone simply because they acknowledge being imperfect. In fact, we would have to ask why someone would admit to being imperfect and capable of making mistakes if not to caution you against putting complete trust in them. It's just not the statement you make if your aim is to get people to trust you 100%. However, one does not have to be perfect in order to gain the trust of others. How could an imperfect human gain the trust of others to a reasonable degree? It would be how that person conducts himself when mistakes are made. Is he willing to admit them? Does he humbly apologize? Is he troubled by any adverse effect his mistake had on others? Is he willing to make amends? In Part 1, a few examples were given, showing that the Watchtower organization has in the past been willing to apologize to its readers for mistakes that were printed in its literature. However, none of the errors apologized for resulted in causing any severe or lasting harm to anyone. No action was necessary beyond a simple acknowledgement for the error. This gives the impression that no one is ever seriously harmed by following what is printed in the magazines. So, when governing body members admit that they are imperfect like everyone else, it is not to caution you against putting trust in them. No, it's exactly the opposite. They want you to feel confident that you can still trust them completely. That's why they claim that theirs is the best imperfect organization on earth because, unlike other imperfect organizations, no lasting harm will come to you from following their imperfect guidance. Because, as they claim, they are guided by God, who cares for you and has your best interests at heart, any mistakes amount to no more than minor temporary inconveniences. That would be nice if it were true. But it isn't. And later on in this video, I will provide examples of persons who suffered tremendously from following direction coming from the Watchtower organization. Direction that later was changed. But didn't Jesus tell those wanting to become disciples of his that they should expect to experience suffering? Yes.
If anyone wants to come after me, let him disown himself and pick up his torture stake and keep following me. Do not think I came to bring peace to the earth. I came to bring not peace, but a sword. For I came to cause division, with a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Indeed, a man's enemies will be those of his own household. Whoever has greater affection for father or mother than for me is not worthy of me. And whoever has greater affection for son or daughter than for me is not worthy of me.
But notice, the suffering was not caused by Jesus. It was caused by persecution from the outside. Jesus never meant for his disciples to be the ones responsible for causing division by persecuting others. That's why Jesus could also make the following invitation.
Come to me, all you who are toiling and loaded down, and I will refresh you. Take my yoke upon you, and learn from me, for I am mild-tempered and lowly in heart, and you will find refreshment for yourselves. For my yoke is kindly, and my load is light.
Not only do Christians suffer, God has also, throughout history, permitted the suffering of all humans.
For the creation was subjected to futility, not by its own will, but through the one who subjected it, on the basis of hope that the creation itself will also be set free from enslavement to corruption, and have the glorious freedom of the children of God. For we know that all creation keeps on groaning together and being in pain together until now. Not only that, but we ourselves also who have the first fruits, namely the Spirit, yes, we ourselves groan within ourselves, while we are earnestly waiting for adoption as sons, the release from our bodies by ransom.
So, according to this, God has good reason for temporarily permitting suffering. But here's the question: is there any example in the Scriptures showing that God directed persons to follow a specific course that brought suffering, only to later change that direction? Apparently, the Watchtower organization believes there is. In an article entitled, "Strengthening Our Confidence in God's Righteousness," the August 15, 1998 Watchtower states,
In order to please Jehovah, the Jews were required to obey the Ten Commandments and also a wide variety of about 600 additional laws. Later, under the Christian arrangement, obedience to these laws as such was no longer a requirement for serving Jehovah, not even for fleshly Jews. The laws no longer binding included those dealing with circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, offering animal sacrifices, and observing certain dietary restrictions. Jews, including the apostles, who became Christians, were released from the obligation to keep laws that they were required to obey when they were under the law covenant. Did they complain that God's arrangement was unrighteous in having formerly required of them things that were no longer necessary? No, they rejoiced in the broadened understanding of Jehovah's purposes.
But let's think about this for a moment. What hardship or suffering did the law bring to those under it? Secondly, the law had a divine origin.
Why then the law? It was added to make transgressions manifest, until the offspring should arrive to whom the promise had been made, and it was transmitted through angels by the hand of a mediator.
The governing body, on the other hand, admits that what is printed in the Watchtower does not.
The governing body is neither inspired nor infallible. Therefore, it can err in doctrinal matters or in organizational direction. In fact, the Watchtower Publications Index includes the heading Beliefs Clarified, which lists adjustments in our scriptural understanding since 1870. Of course, Jesus did not tell us that his faithful slave would produce perfect spiritual food.
So, it is extremely arrogant to make such an obviously false comparison between God's perfect law and the imperfect shifting opinions of men. But, what about those errors in doctrinal matters and organizational direction, since 1870, admitted to here? How have trusting members of the Watchtower organization been affected by them? Has anyone been harmed by partaking of the less than perfect spiritual food produced by the governing body? In his book, Crisis of Conscience, former governing body member Raymond Franz writes, "Consider the organizational position taken regarding hemophiliacs and the use of blood fractions, such as factor VIII, a clotting factor, to control against fatal bleeding. For many years, inquiries sent by hemophiliacs to the headquarters organization, or its branch offices, received the reply that to accept such blood fraction one time could be viewed as not objectionable, as, in effect, medication. But to do so more than once would constitute a feeding on such blood fraction, and therefore be considered a violation of the scriptural injunction against eating blood. Years later, this ruling changed. Those staff members who worked at answering correspondence knew that, in the past, they had sent out letters to the contrary, and that hemophiliacs who had taken their one-time injection were still under the impression that to do so again would be counted as a violation of Scripture. They could bleed to death because of holding to such a stand. The administration was not in favor of publishing the new position in print, since the old position had never been put in print, but only conveyed to the particular individuals inquiring. To publish something would require first explaining what the old position had been, and then explaining that it was now obsolete. This did not seem desirable. So, The staff workers made a diligent search through their files, to try to find the names and addresses of all those persons who had written inquiries, and another letter was sent to each, advising of the change. The staff workers felt better about this. Then they realized that many of the inquiries had come in by phone, and that they had no record of such phone calls, and absolutely no way of determining who such inquiring hemophiliacs were. Whether, in the interim, between the old ruling and the new, some had died, they did not know, whether some whom they had not been able to contact, would yet die because of holding to the old ruling, they did not know. They only knew that they had followed instructions, being loyally obedient to their superiors in the organization. This change in policy was made official at the June 11, 1975, session of the governing body. It was not until 3 years later, in 1978, however, that the change was finally put into print, though rather obscurely stated and, strangely, listed in with the issue of the use of serum injections to combat disease, whereas hemophilia is not a disease but a hereditary defect, in the June 15, 1978, issue of the Watchtower. It still was not acknowledged that this represented a change in the previous policy as to multiple use of blood fractions by hemophiliacs.
In our issue of June 1, 1974, we presented in this column a detailed consideration of the use of vaccines, which do not contain blood, and of serums that are made from blood. For such details, please see that presentation on pages 351, 352. It acknowledged that the medical profession is increasingly turning from the use of whole blood transfusions. Instead, human blood is being separated into primary components that can be transfused: red cells, white cells, platelets and plasma. On this we said, we believe that the use of blood as a life-sustaining transfusion, or the use of a blood component to accomplish a similar purpose, is obviously in conflict with the scriptural command to abstain from blood. What, however, about accepting serum injections to fight against disease, such as are employed for diphtheria, tetanus, viral hepatitis, rabies, hemophilia and Rh incompatibility? This seems to fall into a grey area. Some Christians believe that accepting a small amount of a blood derivative for such a purpose would not be a manifestation of disrespect for God's law; their conscience would permit such. Others, though, feel conscientiously obliged to refuse serums because these contain blood, though only a tiny amount. Hence, we have taken the position that this question must be resolved by each individual on a personal basis. We urge each one to strive to have a clear conscience and to be responsive to God's guidance found in His Word.
How many hemophiliacs died as a result of following this direction? How many later died as a result of not realizing that a change had been made? A change that now allowed them to exercise their own conscience before God on the matter. In the early 1940s, during the Second World War, the Watchtower Society developed the policy that required brothers who were conscientious objectors to refuse alternative service. It was reason, since this service was offered in place of military service, and since military service involved the shedding of blood, that anyone accepting the substitute became blood guilty. Failure to adhere to this policy would mean being viewed automatically as disassociated for involving oneself in what was termed non-neutral activity, and being treated the same as if they had been disfellowshipped. Considerable discussion on this topic took place between Watchtower headquarters and various branches around the world. For example, this letter came in from the branch in Belgium.
Few brothers are really in position to explain, with the Bible, why they refuse to accept the alternative civilian work, rather than military service. As far as military service and political affairs are concerned, they can explain that the Bible condemns these activities, but regarding the civilian service, very few are able to demonstrate, with the Holy Scriptures, that such a service cannot be accepted instead of the military service. Not only the youths but some elders have difficulties to explain that position. We have heard that some brothers were unable to explain their neutral position before the judges, who sometimes play with them, like a cat with a mouse. Nevertheless, the brothers refuse the civilian service in lieu of active military service because, basically, they know it is wrong, and that the society views it as such. For that reason, the courts said to the brothers that they were pushed by the society to refuse the provision of the civil service.
Ray Franz comments. The letter from the Belgian branch committee, signed by the branch coordinator, makes clear to what it was that loyalty was being shown. It recounts the committee's efforts loyally to uphold organizational policy. It also shows that it was not a case of loyally upholding Christian principles as they understood them, nor of responding to the proddings of conscience that caused the young men to reject alternative service and thereafter be imprisoned for 2 years. The truth is that few, in fact very few of the brothers affected could explain with the Bible the basis for that policy. The letter states that nonetheless they refused alternative service because they knew it was wrong and that the society views it as such. Since they could not explain it scripturally, their knowing it was wrong can actually mean only that, for them, whatever the society in Brooklyn said, determined the rightness or wrongness of the matter, not what the scriptures themselves said. Yet, the Watchtower Society tries to make it appear that their refusal of alternative service was due to their own conscientious decision. Note this statement in the book, United in Worship of the Only True God.
An examination of the historical facts shows that not only have Jehovah's Witnesses refused to put on military uniforms and take up arms, but, during the past half-century and more, they have also declined to do non-combatant service or to accept other work assignments as a substitute for military service. Why? Because they have studied God's requirements and then made a personal, conscientious decision. No one tells them what they must do.
Terry Wallstrom was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, incarcerated for refusing non-combatant military service, from 1967 to 1969, beginning in Tarrant County lockup in Fort Worth, Texas, and ending in Seagoville Federal Correctional Institution. In his book entitled, I Wept by the Rivers of Babylon, he writes, "If you understand nothing else, try to understand this one thing. In this religion, like a marriage, you bind and intertwine your life in such a way, your own personal preferences fade to second place. Your commitment and your loyalty define you among your peers. Loyalty to the governing body is more important than a simple choice of right or wrong. Loyalty, friend or foe identification, affects everything. They may be wrong, but, in the long run, you simply accept it. Why? So much trust has been placed in the bona fide authority, that these men are being used by Jehovah. It is no different than a child who trusts his parent, even though what is being asked sounds far-fetched. You simply shrug and do as you are told, in total trust." Describing his experience in the county jail he writes, "How can I really place you in there with me, and make it feel more real? Let's try this. First, put away your cell phone and your laptop, and turn off your TV. Throw out comfort. No chairs or couches or a bed with a mattress. Get rid of your kitchen, groceries, restaurants, snacks or candy. You cannot drive your car. You will not go outside. You cannot turn off the lights. Day and night look the same in a crowded room, with people who have nothing to say that interests you. Conversation is impossible. There are no friends or family. You won't see the face of a baby, or a child, or woman, for years. County jail is a grave, where the corpses still blink. Noise never ends, and you'll learn to sleep, when you're too exhausted not to. There is no color, and there will be no beauty, or music, or art, only what you've stored in your own heart before you walked inside. Okay? Have I made it clear enough? It isn't TV jail, or movie jail. Jail is leaning on hard surfaces, for hours at a time, and squatting without new thoughts, for days on end. Jail is trying not to breathe, while breathing just enough to stay alive. Jail is living at the bottom of the drain, with matted hair, and split rotten teeth. Jail is for cheaters, thieves and molesters, bullies, sober drunks, and dangerous creeps. There is no safe distance, or personal space, or intermission, to the stretching elasticity of time." He went on to describe the frantic begging and sobbing of an inmate, as he was being sexually abused, and then, later on in the book, the humiliating experience of his own rape. The May 1, 1996, Watchtower reversed this policy. In an article entitled, Paying Back Caesar's Things to Caesar, it stated,
"However, there are lands where the state, while not allowing exemption for ministers of religion, nevertheless acknowledges that some individuals may object to military service. Many of these lands make provision for such conscientious individuals not to be forced into military service. In some places a required civilian service, such as useful work in the community, is regarded as non-military national service. Could a dedicated Christian undertake such service? Here again, a dedicated, baptized Christian would have to make his own decision on the basis of his Bible-trained conscience.
During the over 50-year span of time that this policy was in force, many Christian men were imprisoned, because of not being allowed to make their own decision, on the basis of their Bible-trained conscience, and choose alternative service. It was required of them to obey, or face judicial action, even though the directions coming from the organization at the time did not appear practical from a human standpoint. Yet no apology was ever issued to Terry Wallstrom, or any of those brothers that suffered. Commenting on this, Raymond Franz writes, in place of apology, the organization instead seems to feel it deserves applause for having made changes it should have had the good sense and humility to have made decades earlier, changes that were resisted, in the face of ample evidence presented from the scriptures, both from within the body and from branch office committees. Some of these branch committees presented not only all the scriptural evidence found in the May 1, 1996 Watchtower, but even more extensive and more carefully reasoned scriptural evidence. They did this back in 1978, but what they wrote was, in effect, shrugged off, or discounted, by those of the governing body, who held out for maintaining the traditional policy then in place. In fact, the society went even further, by claiming that those persons suffered, not because of following their direction, but because of following their own conscience. Notice how that same 1998 Watchtower reasons.
In the past, some witnesses have suffered for refusing to share in an activity that their conscience now might permit. For example, this might have been their choice years ago as to certain types of civilian service. A brother might now feel that he could conscientiously perform such without overstepping his Christian neutrality regarding the present system of things. Was it unrighteous on Jehovah's part to allow him to suffer, for rejecting what he now might do without consequences? Most who have had that experience would not think so. Rather, they rejoice that they had the opportunity of demonstrating publicly, and clearly, that they were determined to be firm on the issue of universal sovereignty. What reason could anyone have, to regret having followed his conscience, in taking a firm stand for Jehovah? By loyally upholding Christian principles as they understood them, or by responding to the proddings of conscience, they proved worthy of Jehovah's friendship. Certainly, it is wise to avoid a course that would disturb one's conscience, or that would likely cause others to be stumbled. We can think in this regard of the example that the Apostle Paul set. In modern times, there have been some witnesses, who were very strict in their view, of what they would, or would not do. For that reason, they suffered more than others. Later, increased knowledge helped them to expand their view of matters. But they have no reason to regret having earlier acted in harmony with their conscience, even when this possibly brought extra suffering. It truly is commendable that they demonstrated their willingness to suffer in faithfulness to Jehovah, to do all things for the sake of the good news. Jehovah blesses that kind of godly devotion. The Apostle Peter wrote with insight, "If, when you are doing good and you suffer, you endure it, this is a thing agreeable with God."
So, in the first instance, by comparing their changed direction to the Mosaic Law, they place the blame on God for the suffering that a person had experienced. But now, they place the blame on the person themselves for following their own conscience. But if the previous direction, given by them, was a mandate for others to follow, and accompanied by a penalty for those that disobeyed, and was not something explicitly stated in the Bible, it is nothing short of wicked for them to blame anyone else. In reality, it follows the course of Adam, in attempt to shift the blame to both God and his wife, when questioned by God for eating from the forbidden fruit. What does this say about such an organization? An organization that would admit mistakes involving an incorrectly labeled product, an art error, a photo mix-up, or an incorrectly named animal or bird, and receive praise for humbly doing so, and yet not mention a word about mistakes seriously affecting the freedom, health, indeed the very lives of its members, but instead seeks to shift the blame for those errors onto God and its members. How could any sincere lover of God justify continuing to remain a part of such an organization.